We're on recording. So
Okay.
this is our Conversations That Matter as part of our worship service for the 14th of February in 2021. I'm aware that the possibilities for conversations that could matter specifically today could be multiple by giving focus to Valentine's Day, February 14th, Chinese New Year's to be recognized, and the Family Day regional holidays across Canada. All good things, especially in the time of COVID. But I'm keeping our focus again this week on Black History Month in my conversations today with Ralph Thomas from St. John, New Brunswick, my hometown, and I will introduce Ralph in just a few minutes, a little further. My aim with this Conversations That Matter series is to help and encourage us to be informed, deep listeners, and gracious, faith-based conversationalists should we ever be faced with one of the hot-button issues in the world around us. If someone with a different perspective than ours confronts us, someone who is ultimately a fellow human being, can we have a civil and respectful discussion without it ending in ugly disagreement or worse? I believe we can. And as people of faith, I believe it is incumbent upon us to seek to do so. Still, we often struggle with this. So by listening to the story of another and creating connections and even friendships, we can actively change the temperament of divisiveness that seems to have become too dismissive and even destructive in the world around us. Throughout the history of the world, oppressed peoples have ultimately risen up to fight for their freedom, for a civil society where every race and creed can dwell together for the well-being of all. Now, I know that this might, for some, smack of explicitly today's language, but if we take time to delve into the personal stories, the desire and the driving force, generation after generation, expresses the same hope. So why do we find ourselves in this repetitive cycle? Our psalm reading for today reminds us that God sets the parameters of right and wrong, just and unjust, holy and unholy. It's Psalm 50. And we human created beings don't set those parameters. And we are accountable to God. So let us open our heart and our mind to our own self-deceptions of power and right over others, and rather choose to listen and give thanks to one another, to lift up the oppressed, heal the brokenhearted, provide opportunity for the poor and outcast. So today, I'm here and glad to welcome and to speak with Ralph Thomas. Ralph Thomas is known to me through wonderful connections from my hometown. A member of our congregation here in Tsawwassen United Church is Lynn Meinert. Her sister Judith is living in St. John, where they both originated from, and is connected directly with Ralph. And so Judith and Ralph, I say welcome to you today, especially in our conversation today, Ralph. Ralph,
thank you very much.
Has an amazing background, and I won't tell you everything, but I think a few things just so you hear a hint, and he'll probably expand it a little bit. He's a founding member of the New Brunswick Black History Society. He has been the president of Prude Inc., which is Pride and Race, Unity and Dignity Through Education. And he has many honors and recognitions and awards for his work in community life and in the actions that he's been involved in throughout his life. And in 2012, he was honored as a recipient of the New Brunswick Human Rights Award. These are just a few hints of the expansive involvement that Ralph has had. And so, Ralph, it's so good to have you here today.
It's good to be here.
I'm going to ask a couple of kinds of questions that will be open-ended, and Ralph is going to respond to them in whatever way he wishes to, and open his story and respond to some of the, I hope, provocative questions that I might bring, just to get people thinking and cause you to hear what is being spoken today as a challenge in our daily life. So, Ralph, I'm going to start by asking you to tell us a little bit about your story from your perspective, who you are, what formed you to be who you are, and what gifts you have that you share and want to bless others with.
Well, I'm just your regular country boy from Willow Grove, St. John, New Brunswick. And I grew up in a poor atmosphere. And at a time in the 40s and 50s, I grew up in Willow Grove. It's about 16 miles away from a city. And if you ever had to communicate back and forth, you had to walk half the way home and hitchhike the other half. Or if you were unlucky one night or day, you may have walked the whole length of the mileage that it took to get from point A to point B. And it was a good time when I sit back and look at it in depth. I can't ever remembering, you see, I was brought up by my aunt and uncle, and they lived in Willow Grove, and I moved there. They moved me there when I was 2 years old. I was probably one of the victims of circumstances where the immediate family, the Thomas family, could not afford to bring me up, and they were, they shipped part of the family to the country where they could afford to take care of their children, and they did different things back in the 40s. And I was very fortunate that I got to go with my aunt and uncle because they brought me up the tough way. And I always had lots of food. I always had warm house to be in. And it was that alone I began to appreciate when I became a teenager and a young adult, because yes, we were poor. We had no money. The monies that we had to put it into buying the groceries and doing the things, but we lived off of the land. And we lived in harmony with other folks. And let me explain that, because I'm involved, as you know, with the New Brunswick Black History Society. And my thing in the last 10 years have been, what about the Black history in Willow Grove? And what about the Black history in New Brunswick? So when I look at and I say to people, oh, Jinkers, it was a tough time coming up and we didn't have this, we didn't have that. And I never ever heard my aunt and uncle say anything that complained about how they were how they were going forward with their life and bringing me up. And I don't know how they did it, because, we lived off the land. Like I said, we had lots of animals. We had potatoes and carrots and all the good stuff for you in the ground. We did all that. And if you wanted a bicycle, a used one, or a used car, you had to get out and find a way to earn it. And you either worked for your next door neighbors or the neighbor down at the end of the road, or you had a job. And then being young, you had to work for your neighbors, because you had to come home and do the chores, and then you had to work the extra time on the weekends or whatever you could, whether it was picking blueberries, strawberries, or whatever. You did your extra work. You may have got gotten that secondhand bicycle.
Mhm.
And that's some of the things that we grew up. But the thing that I want to share with people is I thought it was tough. But the people in the 1700s, which were loyalists, and we say loyalists today because they came with the white folks that came to our parts, they came with the white loyalists. But we have forgotten the fact that if we came in loyalist time, then we must be the black loyalists.
Mhm.
We now, we know that a lot better, and we understand that a lot better.
Yeah.
And it was tough coming as a loyalist.
Mhm.
You don't have the much times. I touch the loyalists, but I go to the refugees. And I'll explain it a little bit behind me because you may see some of the things. You will see the loyalists. And it's a wonderful story with the loyalists when we deal with St. John, a wonderful story and a tough story and a struggle.
Mhm.
So let's go back to the refugees, for example. Refugees were American slaves. And they came up with an agreement, and I won't get into all the details because people will want to look that up now online once we get talking about it. But
Mhm.
they fought for the British against the Americans.
Right.
And the British promised them land. They promised them a place to build their community. They gave them the opportunity to be free like everybody else.
Mhm.
But when they came to these parts in Willow Grove and Loch Lomond, they didn't get the land that they were told that they would get. They got the land that was quite barren. Nothing would grow on it. And for an example, we got 50 acres to 55 acres, where our white neighbors got 300 acres, 200 acres, 1,000 acres of choice land. So that was a slowdown right off. Just imagine going to a place, you were a slave in the United States. You were told that tomorrow you're going to work the fields, or you're going to work in the barns, or you're going to work in the house. You were fed, you had a roof over your head, you had nothing really to worry about to exist, at least, even though you were a slave.
Mhm.
But take that slave from the South and the weather conditions and put them in a place like Canada and in Willow Grove and put them out, the regular spot, all these people to the foot of King Street, which you're familiar with. And we sorted out from there. There was 371 refugees came in 1815. They were given this so-called land. And I think you've seen the area where the burial grounds is. It's at the corner of the Base Road and the corner of the St. Martin's Road. And if you look at one side of the road, it's nothing but trees. It's all grown up. And the opposite side was the same way when our refugees came to this spot.
Mhm.
I said, here it is, make a go of it.
Yeah.
Now they just had enough rations to squeak by. They just had enough clothing and enough things so that they could exist in this environment back in the 1800s. Just figure it. They got there in 1815.
Amazing. Yeah.
And they didn't settle where they were supposed to stay really until 1836.
Oh my goodness. Yeah.
And
So
when they made,
yeah, while I was just going to say, while it was they were free,
yeah,
they had their own, but the advantage was not given to them in any way as it was given to others. So and while you received that, or while they received that, and they recognized that as a better place than previous, it was
yes,
still a huge challenge.
it was a big challenge.
Yeah.
And I don't understand how they ever do that. They would have to have the faith, which they had.
Yeah.
They had the faith and they had the willpower and they had the strength to get through that
Mhm.
struggle. And along the way, now when they came to these parts, if you were a loyalist, you were treated like cattle, or you were treated like a piece of the equipment, or you were treated like an alien.
Yeah.
The same came for the refugees when they came in 1815, because of that war of 1812 and 1815. It was the same, because then you didn't want the lawyers, the loyalists didn't want anybody else coming to these parts.
Right.
And
Yeah.
there were other folks that didn't want to give up their land that they had taken.
Yeah.
Again, they were treated like aliens, but there were people that had a feel for the poor and the black folks. And in particular in Willow Grove, and as you'll see the stamps when we talk about stamps and stuff, but you will see that the church was built for the black folks and some of the poor folks.
Right.
And it was built by a pastor by the name of Edmund DeVal. And if you punch in Edmund DeVal, you will see a lot more about them now just by going on the Prude website. And you punch in New Brunswick Black History, and Edmund DeVal's story will come up and what he did for the black folks. Edmund DeVal came to the parts of Willow Grove as the supervisor of schools. In other words, he was the person that taught teachers how to become teachers. And he came from England. And as he went on to be very successful in the school connections and how the schools should be run, in his later years, he became a pastor. He became a pastor, really, and you would know this, Reverend Dan. You would remember Jermaine Street Baptist Church.
Yes.
He became a pastor through that church.
Okay.
And what ignited a plea to help the black folks was Edmund DeVal. And he would go to the country and he would deal with the black folks. But he was told by the mother church, don't bring the black people to my church or to this home church.
Yeah.
And he said, well, that's not what I studied from the Word of God. And he decided to move to Willow Grove. Short distance from where you see that big, huge cross. A short distance from there. He and his 3 daughters, I believe, moved to Willow Grove. They moved there to be a service to the people. You probably read about him yourself, but just a review, he had a goal with that church. That church was to be built. He started building that church in 1875, and it was to be finished by 1878, and it was finished in that time debt-free.
Wow. Yeah.
And it was probably a $1,500 item back then. But he got donations all the way from England and all the way from other parts of to build that church for the black folks. Now, why was the daughters' names brought up? These daughters' names were brought up because you talk about diversity. It started way back then, and it was ahead of its time. But what they did was they taught and showed how you could bring black folks and white folks together, And, the white folks are saying back in the day, what? We're going to have tea with the black people? You got to be kidding me, Pastor. But they did it.
They did. Yeah.
The daughters did that. And the pastor did that. And he taught them how to exist over and above just living off the land and in the fields and doing the things that they had to do just to exist. They taught them to stretch. Yeah. They taught them how to do raffles and how to do picnics and how to make things that would bring them a little dollar here and there. The ladies did that along with the pastor.
Yeah.
So that is one of the stories of Willow Grove.
Yeah.
And the other story is so that we can get a picture of what happened back then. Yes, there was a struggle. And as you see the big cross that's there now, and at the bottom of that cross, it says, the struggle. a gentleman donated, Victor Wojak donated that cross. And it's as you see, it's angle iron. It's great. It's huge. And it stands 13 to 14 feet in the air.
Oh my goodness, yeah.
And he put that together. And when you look at the cross at first, you think, gee whiz, that's a wonderful looking cross. But really, there's 3 crosses in one.
Okay.
You look at the cross from the roadside, and the left side represents Alabama. When we talk Alabama and when we talk Mississippi, which is the right side, we talk about Martin Luther King, fighting for the poor, fighting for equal rights. And the center cross that's got the black trim on it, and it looks like it's leaning, is our Savior carrying the load for everybody.
Yeah.
And that was what a gentleman donated to us to set on that spot, so that you don't drive by, even if we get to the point where we can't mow the grass anymore, or we can't update things like we've been doing in the last 15 years or so. Somebody will know that that was the spot where the refugees settled, 74 of them to be exact. And they started from scratch and survived. They had the strength, they had the willpower, and they had God's help because they believed in the church. They did. You will see in pictures and everything of Willow Grove, you will see a log cabin that was in the 1800s. That log cabin was a meeting house, as was a place to worship, and it was a schoolhouse back then. That got destroyed by fire in some way. And then you say, well, how did they make out all these years, 20 years wandering around just working for somebody else and going to town and coming back? They had to go to town and come back right away, because then if you stayed off your property for a solid week, you could have had a squatter squat the land, and there's nothing they could do about it because there was nothing officially signed that said they owned the property.
No way. Oh my.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So those were some of the upcomings. It's just people has to realize it. And I came along in the 40s and thought the ground was poor and this was poor and it was terrible. And how'd they ever do it? But when you think about it, in 1783, when the Loyalists came, and then in 1815, another group of people came, and then there was a group of people came in between them, and they had to survive in conditions that you wouldn't believe. Now that's the Willow Grove story, and when we get close to our time, Reverend, I will show you the honor that we had as people, those who are left in Willow Grove, or those who were people from Willow Grove. We had something given to us this year that was well earned. And we honored people, everyday people, not the first person who became a teacher. That was great too. Not the first person who became a lawyer. And we have those stories in St. John as well. Not the first person who had its own restaurant and wasn't allowed to be out after dark in the city of St. John, or wasn't allowed to fish the Bay of Fundy, or wasn't allowed to fish the streams. You know, Cornelia Sparrow is that name. And the women who are listening here today, you realize in that same timeline as Cornelia Sparrow, which was 1850 and on, there was a woman who was bought a ice business. Her husband bought an ice business from Cornelia Sparrow. He ran it for a few years and died, and she took over the business. She came originally from Nova Scotia, hooked up with this gentleman, married this gentleman. She was called the Ice Lady. And ran the business. and was successful with the business. And she had white people working for her and black people working for her. And she was a black lady running a business. I mean, those things didn't happen in the day, but in the 1800s, those runaway slaves came here and did that in St. John, New Brunswick and Willow Grove.
Okay. Yeah. A different time for sure, but all of it significant in hearing, I think, the challenge. We talk about it today. We use the language of systemic injustice, and it's not a bad word. But when we hear the story that you're telling us, how the injustice was that yes, there was opportunities open, but they weren't the same opportunities, and there was none of the same kind of support for those opportunities given to others. So it's just fascinating to hear that. So one of the questions that I keep coming back to, yes, things have moved, things have changed, but has that systemic piece shifted, or is it still present there? Is there still a significant disparity?
In Willow Grove, back then, I would say that everybody got along. Diversity started in Willow Grove back in the 1800s when you look at it. And people, getting along. Like you didn't say anything nasty about anybody. And if you were a youngster growing up and said something that was off key or out of color or anything like that, the next door neighbor to that black person had the right, as far as they had an agreement, as any of my kids do this wrong and that wrong, you skite them a little and send them home to me, and then they're in trouble more, right? And it was a way that it came together. Now, my brother and my sister lived in the city of St. John. And when they were growing up, they went through all this stuff about you can't go here and you can't go in the Admiral Beatty front door. If you ever enter the Admiral Beatty, you have to go around the back door to enter. They went through all that. You can't go to the Riviera restaurant and all that. Now, this is 50s and 60s. And you can't do this and you can't do that. And was there blatant racism? Yes, there was in the city. They would come up to you and use words that, we can't repeat, but the N word was most popular. And the city of St. John. But I'll tell you a story on the city of St. John, just to touch. When did change start to come? It is not realized. Just because we search for our Black history and find all these tough stories and wonderful stories, but little do people know that the Quakers came to Beaver Harbor, which is an hour away from the city of St. John. The Quakers came to Beaver Harbor with black folks. And the black folks that they brought with them, there were 14 people came. And those black folks made a decision with the rest of the community, like everybody else. In 1783, that happened. And as we have dug up the history of all this, now we say, okay, where was the sign that said no slave owners allowed? And I happened to be in the hospital waiting for my wife, and another person was in the hospital waiting for his wife. He came over to me and said, do you know anything about Black history? And I said, a little bit. And that was like 10 years ago. And it is a little bit. That's all I know, because I just find it. And I want to get the people to search it. So that what we're talking about is the true story. Prove it in the book called Blacks in New Brunswick. Show me in the books called Negroes in the Maritimes. That was the way we found our different histories. Getting back to Beaver Harbor, those folks were way ahead of us, or way ahead of their time, when they stood up and said, Black folks should be treated equal, like any other human being. And they stood up They suffered for that. I mean, they got their villages burned out, and they got this thing, you know, we talk about the Penfield stretch and everything. Well, those people that ended up in Penfield were people who settled first in Beaver Harbor.
Mhm.
Whole village all of a sudden burnt. Said it was a forest fire, but we think otherwise.
Otherwise, yeah.
Now, that was the beginning of people starting to realize that no matter what color you are, or who you are, what religion, you're a human being.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you should be treated as such. So it
Mhm.
started that way, where people helping people. Is there systemic racism in the city of St. John still? I'm told there is. And the reason why I say that is I only can remember 2 times that anybody ever said anything racist to me. And once when I went to get rent, when I first got married, and I went to get the place, and the guy said, no, it's gone. And I could tell, we were young then, and we could tell that he's lying. So we go back and we make the phone call and said, is that property still ready up there? I said, yeah, come on down, see it. Instead of fighting about it like they do today and get involved with it, and there's nothing wrong with that. That's what you want to do. We said, we don't have time for that back then.
Yeah. Yes.
Because I didn't experience a whole lot of racism on the way up. My
Right.
brothers and sisters did. My brother would always be in a fight with somebody because somebody used the N-word.
Yeah.
Or somebody played games that would be detriment to him.
Yeah. Yeah.
And my cousins and all the rest of the folks that lived in the city. Out in the country, different set of rules,
Different. Yeah.
different guidelines. People pulled together.
Yeah.
What is it like today, Pat, Reverend? It's still when young folks and young students stand up and tell you what their teachers had done to them on the way up.
Yeah.
About you guys better just go get a job somewhere as a laborer because you're not going to be able to do it. You going to be a teacher? Really? You know, that was the attitude. Some of that stuff still sticks. And I was very surprised when we had the March Black Lives Matter this summer.
Yeah.
And the youth that stood up and talked about tough times that they had not too long ago when we look at it, and that still having trouble.
Still there. Still there.
And that's why we, and PRUDE stands for Pride of Race, Unity, Dignity, through education. You know why we say through education? Because when you have education, things are made easier for you.
Yeah.
That's what we talk about when we go to the schools and show them where the Black folks was outstanding, or the troubles they had. And the kids today are more eager when you say to them, what do you think about them folks going through all that again? And they'd say, we would never stand for that, Mr. Thomas. And that's where the youth is thinking today. But let's feed the youth with positive things.
Yeah. No,
and not a whole lot of negative and hate.
So, Ralph, wonderful. Boy, there's so much. I'm needing to draw our time a little bit to a close here, but 2 quick things that I want to touch on briefly with you.
Okay.
You've named it already, and I appreciate, and I know your background in this. In the middle of all of this question that's going on in our societies right now around, equality and racism, prejudice, however that's being lived out, and we know that it is still present. Where does our faith come into that? How does our faith speak into that? What is it from our faith, that the message that from our faith that we're driven into engaging this conversation rather than hands off, let it just unfold as it will? Because then it never unfolds.
Yeah, it never It never unfolds. And Reverend, you would experience this a lot more than I do. And I'm, we're into COVID now, and our churches are closed down, and we're online, and we're doing things that we're still keeping God's word in front of our church family.
Yeah.
But, the folks that we're talking about that had struggles and tough times, they set the example. You had to go to church. Whether you liked it or not, and whether you liked your neighbor or not, you had to go to church. God was always a part of their lives.
Yeah.
What's happening today, and you know it better than me, is that people don't have time for God.
Yeah.
And that's where we're falling apart. I mean, let's face it. If you look at what's going on around the world, we've been told that in the Bible.
Yeah.
For every nasty thing that's going on today, it was written that it was going to happen.
It would happen. Yeah.
And, it's time for us all to wake up and follow the guidelines of God, what Jesus taught us. And, I mean, it's terrible, like hate.
Yeah.
Where did hate come from? But, we know it was the devil, but hate is coming back so strong now. Look at our neighbors.
Yeah.
I just feel that we've lost sight of what the Lord has said to us and taught us down to the road, and be fair to one another, and love yourself and love one another. And all those things have in the wayside. They don't ask God every morning or give thanks every morning for, just being able to get up and go to work and do your stuff for your community. That a lot of that is lost.
Yes.
So when we look back at history, even as bad as they used it, Martin Luther King's time was a great example. He had people marching in with no violence.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it lasted a long time until the times started to change, and the people that he had marching with no violence became violent. Because they said, if you punch me in the head, I'm going to punch you back.
Yeah.
And that didn't solve everything as we see today.
That's right. Yeah.
And if we're not careful, and if we don't teach your brothers and sisters and treat them equal and treat them like people, you're going to lose.
When we don't learn from history, we're bound to repeat it.
That's right.
Yeah.
It's
Ralph,
a sad time.
It really is. You have one other thing that you wanted to show us, and I'm really happy to take the time.
If you got the time.
There was a special honor that was recognized.
We have an honor that I wanted to show everybody. Number one, I want to show people, if you could see Reverend Dan. As you see, we talked about the cross in Willow Grove in the corner of the Base Road and the St. Martin's Road. There's what it looks like today after 2015. We decided to update it. So it now has, of course, the barren land is still the same. All that stuff that you see there and up here is nothing but weeds.
Yeah, yeah.
And it can't, we use fertilizer, we use lime, we use all the things that enhance property, but not here. And that was the type of land that the black folks was given. And I'll show you a little map on that. But today the cross is here, and we talked about Alabama on this side, the left side, right side was Mississippi, and the leaning cross is our Savior carrying the load for us all. So that's what this sign talks about. For those who come to these parts, it is worth going out and reading what it said.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
It's a wonderful sign. I won't get into it because it's another thing that people should go to and see.
Right.
And we had talked about the Loyalists, and this is what the Loyalists would have looked like the way we read in all the books. They would have come to Beaver Harbor in 1783, and they were given chances to work their own areas and with the help of the rest of the community. And this is what we would figure they look like, according to the books that have been printed thus far. And
Yeah.
then we talked about the refugees, and these are the refugees of 1812 to 1815. And this is what they would have looked like when they came to the foot of King Street
Mhm.
on the boat called the Regulus.
Mm.
Now, the thing that's wrong with that, Reverend, is that history has never been told until just lately.
Mhm.
That history is not taught in the schools. And that's going to change.
Yeah.
It started to change already.
Yeah.
Black Lives Matter made a difference. Prude Incorporated made a difference. You take the New Brunswick Black History Society is making a difference. You know what's happening now? You can see this kind of thing on everybody's website. All of a
Yeah.
sudden, it's a big thing about Black history.
Yeah.
Everybody that has a website that's interested in history, guess what? Black history is also a part of the general history in the world.
Yes.
And you know, because of all these folks here going through that struggle, we had a chance to be honored with a stamp from Canada Post. Just, it was the 22nd really of January. But the 27th of January, I'll show you the announcement that was made. I hope everybody can see it. I'm going to bring it over. Just to let folks have a see. It's one of the most exciting things that have happened. Can you see that
Yeah. Yeah.
properly? Does it have to go over some so everybody gets a chance to
I
see
think-
it? Or is it all right
I
there?
think we can see it. Yeah, that's good.
We
yeah.
talk about Willow Grove.
Yes.
We talk about that little building that you've seen, that we put tools in and stuff so that we can cut the grass and keep the trees all away from the property. We talk about the huge stones that's out there that tells the whole story.
Yeah. That's
And
great.
our reward for that this time, after trying over and over again, Canada Post decided we did have a cause. And this is the stamp that we now have that
Oh.
honor Willow Grove.
Isn't that amazing? Yeah.
Alexander Diggs and Liza Taylor.
Hmm. Wow.
Everyday people.
Yeah.
They made things happen. They took that ground that was out there and they built a lean-to, or they built a pit house, or whatever it took to survive.
Yeah.
They came on the ship called the Regulus.
Okay.
St. John had all these factories, all these things going on then.
Yeah.
Thank
Business.
goodness some of these folks went to work in the city of St. John.
Yeah.
Some of them stayed and worked on the farms, survived.
That's great. Survival. Yeah.
Don't forget, survival. Some of them survived. Some were found frozen in their house.
Yeah.
All these things happen. But these people, you know, the question was asked, I guess, earlier when you and I was talking, is how did they get through all that?
Yeah.
They had faith in God. It's not a thing that we're preaching today just because it's a thing to do. They did have faith in God.
Yes.
When you talk to these folks, they taught you that first.
Yeah. Yeah.
And they did have the drive that said, we can do this in whatever language, you know, they're saying, listen, I'm not going to be held down. I'm going to go beyond that. So this guy is probably one of the toughest guys in St. John in order to survive. This
There you
lady
go.
did whatever she had to do in the way of fun. Like she was, let me just show you a quick thing. This is what she looked like. at the Loch Loming, I don't think you can see that,
Yeah.
but at the Loch Lomond festivals and stuff, she would
Yeah.
dress up like that, and
Oh,
people would
boy.
have fun, and they would have fun. And
Yeah.
they win prizes, get monies, and do things. Then we have this gentleman here, Mr. Diggs. That's this side of the gentleman says they went to the Loch Lomond festivals back then as well,
Yeah.
and put on their uniforms that they fought back then. So
Yeah.
this is one of the
Ralph.
things that the Canada Post said, thank you very much. And it's our honor to give you this stamp.
Ralph, thank you for showing us that. That's good to see and to hear. It's such a small piece, but it's something that you've brought to us today to really think about. And I so appreciate your time and all that you're doing in the community there, have done for years and continue to do. And I would say to you, thank you, Ralph. Thank you.
Just one item, if you
Yeah.
have time, if you
Okay.
squeeze it in. We had talked about properties, and I don't know if you can see it, but
Yeah.
as you see the dark area here, it was
Yes.
55 acres or 54 acres when the rest of the folks had 200, 300, 500 down here,
Yeah.
and so on. And that was the area where you seen the big cross. There it was right here.
Right in the middle there. Yeah.
Base Road in St. Martin. So that
Wonderful.
is a sample of the settlement deed.
Wonderful. Letting us see that. Next time I get home, I hope it will be this summer. I don't know that it will. I will have to make the effort to go out and see that.
Yes, you and I can go on tour.
Yeah, that would be great. Ralph, thank you so much for your time here today and all
my
that
pleasure.
your story and the insights that you've learned. I would say thank you for your thoughts to help us ponder and to think deeply, for your passion that spurs us all on to be better, and your presence with us here that you have blessed us with today. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm going to read just one short paragraph here as the closing of our time, and then the recording will end, and I'll talk to you for a few minutes after that, after the recording's done.
Okay.
So I'd like to draw this together, this conversation to a close with a statement for us to consider. When leadership becomes utterly defined by power and winning and losing, Jesus says leadership is about service and washing each other's feet. When accusation, slander, and attack become the norm of public discourse, Jesus says that those who are peacemakers, the conflict resolvers, will be called the children of God. When the Caesar test is being defined by strong men who say everything is about them, Jesus instructs his followers to render to Caesar only the limited things that belong to him, and to God everything else. When wealth and power become the definition of society and politics, Jesus makes the extraordinary judgment that the ultimate measure of our lives, including God's evaluation of the kings of the nations, is what we have done for the least of these. To live in answer to these ways of Jesus is to become the salt and light that society desperately needs, especially when they are in crisis. This is a quote from the book Christ in Crisis: Why We Need to Reclaim Jesus, written by Jim Wallace of Sojourners Magazine. I thank you for your time, and may all of these things that we have heard cause us to think deeply and seek the ways of God.
Yes. Amen.
I'm just going to turn off this recording.